Hey, so I'm Demon Dev, and this is a continuation of the journey that I'm on to make Double Demons, a VR dating sim with magic combat. So, one question that comes up is how realistic is Double Demons, the dating simulation elements? How realistic to real life? Well, on one hand, it's really inspired by real life more than a perfect attempt to simulate everything about real life for a couple reasons. One, of course, social dynamics is really complicated. Romantic, sexual, social dynamics are even more complicated. But more than that, the premises about real life are very oppressive. And kind of what I mean by that is just that dating culture is really tough and punishing. I think there's some underappreciated aspects of it that will come through in this game and that are there in real life if you stop to appreciate them. But it's still really hard. And something about games uh, is usually supposed to be fair, and you don't always get that in the real world. So that's one big break with realism that I make. The premise is that pretty much every girl in the game is dateable. The steps to make that happen will vary wildly, but in real life, that is certainly not always the case. Beyond that, this is a very realistic emulation of how relationships grow and how the choices you make, how the way you say what you want to say, how that matters and how that affects how people see you. And keeping those values from the correct perspectives. The interesting thing about games is regardless of the actions that the player makes, we actually don't know what the player's internal thought process is. They could be choosing things because the dialogue options resonate with them, but they could also be choosing options for strategic benefit, what the game wants in order for them to get a specific result later on. That tends to be the most typical option, but there are many factors and many play styles which are not purely explained by trying to get results. Playing the meta is appealing for many people. Doing other things is really appealing for people, and all of that should be validated by a game, ideally. This is especially hard to do with a dating simulation, so that's why I think this is a very realistic system. Is it allows for all of that subtlety. So you might ask, okay, so what makes this system so realistic? Well, at the very core, there are two main relationship values that are separate. And in many cases, they wouldn't be in other games. And those two values are the bond and respect. So bond can be thought of as friendship. Respect is a little bit more nebulous, but essentially represents how that character will act towards you in a situation of conflict or in a situation of attraction. So high respect pretty much equals high attraction, high admiration. So keeping these two values separate is an interesting idea because what it means is it allows for all the combinations of those two values. Low friendship, high respect is an interesting sort of rivalry-esque scenario where you maybe don't get along too well, but there's something about the person that you respect. That's certainly a common relationship that exists. You can have high bond and low respect where you like the person, but maybe you're not impressed by them. You wouldn't be attracted to them. You wouldn't go out with them. There's more middle range values where you kind of like them, you're kind of attracted to, you kind of respect them, and then there's more extreme values where you're both um, liking them and very much respecting them, and you could see that as maybe an ideal starting point for a relationship, although many relationships start from many different places. In fact, some relationships start with low respect, and it's more based on the circumstances. One thing that the game does, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, is it allows you to track these two traits. Maybe you have a high friendship and a low respect, which is plenty common in the dating world for you to be good friends, but the strong romantic feelings only go one way. You can track that from the AI's point of view. So the AI character, let's say she likes the player as a friend, but not as a romantic partner. The respect is really low. So what happens when you get into a situation that has romantic overtones? Let's say it's one of those situations where there's like a group hangout, and then as often happens with group hangouts, uh, everyone leaves except for like the last two at some point. So you can track an actual situational variable, which would be sexual tension. And when that gets high enough, actions are interpreted in that domain. So the idea would be normally if you reach out to touch someone on the shoulder with low sexual tension, which is most of the time during the day, they're just like, oh, what are you doing? Like they wouldn't even consider that this would be a romantic gesture. Whereas if you're alone in a secluded area, and maybe after hanging out for a while, then with sexual tension high, they're interpreting, oh, this is a romantic gesture, and so they react to it accordingly. So all of this allows for a lot of things. One, it gives the player strategic tools to orchestrate a situation, such as that, a secluded one-on-one, with high sexual tension, so that they can go for that and it will be interpreted correctly and not just being like, hey, don't touch me, in a like, are you trying to attack me or something, which would be more typical to games. Normally when you're moving close to an AI character, it's to strike them. But within dating simulation, you need a lot more nuance. So by exposing those properties, you can, try to be aware of those values and act accordingly. But if her respect for you is low, it's not going to go well. So even with all the other conditions set, if she doesn't like the way you've been expressing yourself in a respect um, area, then you're going to fail a romance check, and she will, depending on how strongly she feels and her own personality, she'll let you down softly or harshly, and maybe criticizing you for putting her in that situation and not reading the signs that she wasn't into you. Something like that is possible. And that brings me to the next point of realism. So most games, that would represent a fail state, a death, a game over. And in the real life, it's going to feel that way too, except of course, there's no real redo in real life. You kind of put your cards on the table generally if you try to make any kind of romantic advance, and you have to deal with whatever the consequences of that are. And you have to face that person the next day. Now, I'm not trying to be cruel in this game. You can always load a save, but I'm not going to do that for the player. So there are strategic reasons why you would actually want to put yourself out there and find yourself rejected. Not many. It's mostly a negative. You're going to see her respect for you wherever it was before crater even more, maybe go all the way to zero, and block off the ability to rebuild respect. And that's, I think, something that is modeled very realistically in real life. If you ask someone out and they say no, uh, well, clearly their respect for you or the situational variables were such that they weren't attracted enough to you to say yes. But whatever respect that has gets halved or maybe more, because the experience of rejecting you will always push that variable down. That's very true to real life. So it's possible in the game to find redemption, to find some way to establish self-respect, but respect from that character even who has rejected you. But it's very difficult, and I think it's important to allow that to happen, because that does happen, and it's a very powerful story when it does. So there's a system in the game for redemption where you can come to terms with being rejected and give it enough time there's a freeze over effect that happens. So it's completely locks down your ability to build attraction in this character. But if it's been long enough, or if you do some sort of a redemption action, like going out with somebody else, or establishing yourself in some sort of other status position that distances everyone from the uncomfortable fact that you were into them, they weren't into you, and that is something that should be socially respected. It's difficult to navigate that environment. It's one of the many parts of dating culture that people are frustrated with, but maybe don't appreciate the value of. Is It's quite a dance to be able to express yourself and be vulnerable. It's, one step at a time for most people. It's not all at once. People want to be seen for who they truly are, to be validated, and to see if the other person specifically appreciates what's unique about them. But if you essentially release too much content too soon, if you're sharing the most intense parts of your personality right away, it actually can have a displacing effect on the ability for the other person to express themselves. The aggressiveness in presenting yourself can make it difficult to know whether incremental expression on the other person's part will be respected and, paced out. People don't want to be rejected for their deepest, darkest secrets. So usually there's some sort of a stepped process where, depending on how much they like you and how much they want to be close to you, they tell you a little bit at a time. And that's something that I think is really, really important to model in the game as well. So there are these relationship values that kind of go out across time over the game. You started a relatively neutral friendship position, 5 out of 10, and the 0 to 10 scale is what determines every single reaction, every single exchange. You get very familiar with the system, and that's real life too. Every single dialogue exchange probably has an extremely minuscule effect on on the overall relationship in real life, but it does accumulate, and the person gets a sense for what type of person you are and whether they like that or dislike that. But you start at a 5 out of 10 with the friendship, but you actually start out with a 0 out of 10 on the respect meter, which also kind of makes a lot of sense. When you first meet someone, if you were to try to ask them out, well, hopefully they would say no, but they would probably say no because they don't know anything about you, and that matters in a respect way. However, if you were, perfectly polite and just said hi, a lot of people would say hi back because they're feeling relatively neutral about you. They probably don't have a strong reason not to, given the right scenario. If it's not one-on-one, if it's a in public setting or a social setting like school. So those different metrics come into play at different times, and that's why there's two core reaction metrics for the AI. Most of the time, they're using your friendship value to decide how to interact with you on this 0 to 10 scale. But in certain situations that call for an evaluation of that AI's respect towards you or their attraction towards you, then that meter comes in instead. So this respect value that starts at a 0 out of 10, wherever that is, will play the deciding role or the core role. It's a combination of your relationship over time and then how you're expressing yourself in the moment that decides how they will react. So it's really that's the core of what makes this system realistic is you're able to separate the expression from what you're saying, and that allows you to express yourself relatively uniquely as a player, um, no matter what take, whether you're saying yes or no to a question. The way you say yes or no says more about your personality than actually what you believe, which is a controversial idea. Probably not everyone agrees with me on that, but I think it models the world really well, and that's kind of a beginning take on what Double Demons does with dating simulation. There's other things that I'll get into in the future. There's a system to handle whether an AI character feels like they're treating you better or worse than they want to. So if you think of the AI's calculation on a 0 to 10 scale, let's say you say something that really upsets them and it comes in at a 2 out of 10. Well, the next stage of that is it snaps to whatever the closest AI written response is. So maybe the closest written response is like a 5 out of 10. Well, that difference between how she feels at her core on like a purely emotional level is a 2 out of 10, but what she ends up saying is a 5 out of a 10. What that means is there's, 3 points, 3 out of 10 is sort of a frustration. She's being nicer to you than she wants to, and she either just can't find the words or for some other reason decides to be nicer than she really feels. So that is tracked, and the reverse is tracked too. So that would be frustration. But if she's treating you worse than she thinks you deserve, maybe she's is really happy about what you're saying, but in context she doesn't know how to react in any way but mean. Then she will accumulate guilt and have to struggle with that internally. And if these values go up enough, then you can trigger a guilt or a frustration event where they're apologizing to you or demanding change from the player. Uh, so that's really exciting too. But I'll talk more about this in the future. But let me know what you think in the comments if you're interested in how Double Demons models real life. And maybe in the future, I will discuss whether Double Demons will improve your abilities to navigate the dating world. I think it will. And I think that it will be a positive, more wholesome view of the world, even though most people tend to associate math or, psychology and underlying principles with the, you know, kind of dark spin on dating culture. I disagree. I think there's a wholesome aspect, which is just appreciating both the pace that people wanna go at and the uniqueness of people, uh, in the game, but also in real life. Take it easy. I'll speak to you again soon.